Alright, in this section of video we're going to put together the extruder. Here's all the extruder parts. You have the extruder motor, the fan and the heat sink. You have the extruder mount, the peak heat break, the PTFE tube, nozzle, and the heater block. You have a thermistor and a heater cartridge. The components for mounting everything onto the stepper motor. You also have an extruder hardware kit that's going to have various screws, bolts, and springs that are required to put together the extruder head. We have a machined carriage and a part cooling fan and the 3D printed part cooling fan duct. And this is how this goes together. We start off with the kit parts, and you want to locate the little hobbed gear. There is a set screw on there that has to go onto the motor, onto the flat, and the set screw is down. You want to push this all the way down until you snap it so that it is flush with the top of the motor. There is no gap. You then use the smallest hex wrench that you have to tighten in that set screw parallel to the flat. You do want to make sure that as you tighten that down on the flat, the little shoulder at the bottom of the flat does not push the hobbed gear back up off of the face of the motor. This one was just fine. If it does push it off, you can tap a couple taps lightly on the end of the shaft to push it a little further down into the motor, and it'll work just fine. So that is nice and tight. The next piece is the mounting cover, which will fit with the motor cable pointing up. You will then locate the small bevel bolt and insert that using the middle-sized Allen wrench and just snug it down. You then need to put together the lever arm with a small bearing, and then the cap, which has the deep end comes up to the top and snaps into place, holding the bearing in place. And then locate the small shoulder bolt out of the extruder hardware kit and the spring. The spring will go right onto the tension holder. You can then hold that in place and thread in the shoulder bolt, and that can be tight. You then want to make sure that the bearing lines up with the teeth on the hobbed gear. That doesn't have to be exactly flat because the filament is going to push it away from it. It just needs a flat surface to push against. So that is lined up. That is working. Alright, the next sub-assembly is the heater block. Put the heater cartridge mount on the right. Then you also have this set screw. That should be on the bottom. You also have the mounting block. And the PTFE tube will go into the mounting block with that notch down. You then can slip the peak heat break and then the heater block onto it. Now the heater block and the peak heat break should be all flush and flat. There should be no gaps or wobbling in between. It should be nice and tight. You then use the 22mm bolt to snug that on. Now first you want to make sure that this block is parallel with the mounting block, and in snugging this down you want to turn that just tight enough so that it takes a little bit of effort to break the torque back out of it. So I can't quite move this by hand easily. If I really crank on it, I can move it. But I just want that to be snug enough that it doesn't move on its own, but not so tight that I've overcompressed the peak spacer, and when you heat it up, you will melt it if that is overcompressed. So just tight enough that it takes a little bit of effort to break the torque out of the bolt, and not much more. So that is in place, nice and snug. You then want to put the thermistor on. The thermistor mounts on the left side. You can just thread that in and then just finger tight to get it into the block so that it's not moving. Next, you want to install the heater cartridge. And you want just the front portion of the heater cartridge to extend out the other end of the block. It does not need to be centered and move all the way out, because there's going to be a part cooling fan on the other side. You don't want to melt the tip off of that. And then use the smallest Allen wrench to just tighten that down. And you do not put the nozzle on yet. We'll put that on later. But that is what takes up all of any tolerances that are left from the PTFE tube. The back of the nozzle will seal against the PTFE tube. Threads holding it in place. That'll go in finger tight, but very tight. You don't need to use a tool, and it does not need to backseat all the way against the heater block. We'll now mount the stepper motor onto the mounting block. The top holes are for mounting to the motor. The bottom holes will be for the heatsink and the fan. You want to use two 8mm M3 bolts to put the stepper motor onto the mounting block. And these bolts can be tight. There we go. We're now ready to put the heatsink on, which will just mount there. The fan will go on top of that. The cable can come off to the left side. The sticker goes towards the heatsink. And then you use the long bolts to feed through. And then the last portion just needs to be hand tightened snug so that you don't deform the motor mount for the fan. So now the heatsink is snug up against the mounting block. There's no gap. And no movement. Nice and snug. Now the next piece we're going to put on is the PCB for the extruder head. That will get mounted on to the top bracket here with the motor mount on the back left corner. And you will use two M3 bolts to put that on to the mount. And we'll tighten that up by hand so we don't damage the PCB board. We can then plug in the motor cable. We can plug in the heater cartridge, which is the front right. We can plug in the thermistor, which is going to be the front left. And we can plug in the extruder cooling fan, which is the back middle. That is the basic assembly right there. Now the next part is to mount that onto the carriage. The cable, or the cutout in the back, allows for the cables to come straight back and get guided underneath. And then this mounts with the two M3 8mm bolts on the bottom. get those started first and then we'll tighten them down. So that is nice and snug. Cables are coming out the back, and we are now ready to thread in the nozzle, which just threads in finger tight, but then very tight. And notice there's still a little bit of a gap between the nozzle and the heater block. That does not have to be flush against the heater block. Just tight enough against the PTFE to seal so that you're not putting too much pressure on the PTFE that will melt it when it heats up or deform it.